the business model we should want broadband developers to deploy is one that focuses on abundance of broadband capacity and neutrality in the opportunities that broadband infrastructure offers to innovators everywhere, not a business model focused on scarcity and the opportunity of controlling those who deploy for this network. Well, so how could we get that policy here? Well, again, I think the key is to recognize, even if it's technology, as Jerry Faulhaber was telling us, or architecture in the network that produced good policy, even if it was the end-to-end design of the network that produced this open, neutral network that innovators could build on top of, it doesn't follow that regulators should be thinking about how to regulate technology. There will be lots of times that there are games that are going on in the code, but I think we need to recognize a limit in the competence of government regulators to actually evaluate the code and to understand why exactly the games were played in the particular way in which they were played. There is a limit in the government's competence here. There are plenty of legitimate reasons why games would be played in the code, legitimate reasons we think of as proper network management. There are legitimate ways to do that, but my point is, rather than thinking about how best to regulate this code, we need to think about how to regulate the sort of things that the FCC can see very well, can understand very well, and ask the question whether it's sufficient to regulate the things they can regulate easily to assure that what happens at the network layer is not the kind of behavior that destroys the neutral network. Things like contracts and relationships between businesses. That's the stuff that the sort of capacity of the FCC can deal with, and that's the stuff, I think, potentially, that could provide the right incentives for the right business model to drive the objective of network neutrality. So what does that regulation look like? Well, the earliest version, I think, builds on what was originally Chairman Powell's 4 Freedoms. I think we should think of it as Powell's 4 Freedoms plus. So what is the plus? Well, among network neutrality advocates, there's basically been 2 clear descriptions of what the plus is. One, economists refer to as the zero price regulation, ZPR. ZPR is what's, for example, built into Representative Markey's proposed bill, where he says, if a broadband network provider prioritizes data of a particular type, then it must prioritize all data of that type, regardless of origin, without imposing a surcharge. So everything flows at the same price, at the same speed, according to the access provider. Now, I'm going to get some people upset by this, but here you go. I'm actually against ZPR. I don't think it's a good idea. I think, first of all, the title is very misleading. It's a bad title because when you say zero price regulation, people think that companies like Yahoo aren't paying for the internet. Of course they're paying for the internet. They pay an enormous amount of money for the bandwidth that their services provide. But I do think that ZPR regulation blocks productive discrimination, discriminations that actually help facilitate the spread of broadband and growth without risking a threat to network neutrality. So for example, if iFilm wants fast pipes so it can send its films very, very, very fast across the network, but I don't want fast pipes because I just have boring emails to send, we have a structure under ZPR that doesn't allow that distinction to be recognized. So ZPR is one kind of regulation network neutrality proponents have offered. Here's a second, what I call zero discriminatory surcharge rules, ZDS. So for example, that says if you've got a provider that's saying Google pays us X, but iFilm pays us 2X, that's a problem. That kind of discrimination among equivalent providers is the problem. Because if the FCC allows that, it at least creates the possibility of an incentive for a destructive business model. And by that I mean a business model where the incentive of the provider is to inflate the premium price by creating or sustaining scarcity in the ordinary provision of network services to everybody else. But the important difference between the second rule and the first is that the second rule does allow non-discriminatory tiering, meaning each company is offered a most favored nations clause, meaning, for example, a provider could say there's a surcharge for video, but everybody pays the same price for that surcharge. The same price, meaning there isn't the incentive to play games among different providers to facilitate exactly the wrong business model, a business model of scarcity rather than abundance. You know, it's my view that this is where the FCC should start. And it should modify that clear, strong principle in light of a very clear target that I think terrifies the providers, that we get to broadband as a commodity. Not a commodity in the sense that oil is a commodity regulated by OPEC, that's OPEC's brand if you've never seen it before, but in the sense of a commodity of chips or PCs or wheat or sand, a commodity where there's fundamental competition in the provision of this commodity, driving the price of that commodity down. That's the objective, and we get there through a constant focus on this as the end. And one more point about this. In this objective, the principle of end-to-end or network neutrality should be thought of as a very central principle, just like the First Amendment is thought of as a central principle in the regulation of speech. It is a heavy weight against any intervention or any change that compromises that principle. But just as the First Amendment is but a heavy weight and not an absolute bar, so too this would not function necessarily as an absolute bar where there are countervailing interests that don't compromise the underlying incentive to produce neutral, open, competitive network. Finally, I don't know if you remember this book by Susskind that revived this idea inside the Bush administration of an opposition to something called reality-based policymaking. I'm one who has some hope that we're going to get out of that mentality of anti-reality-based policymaking, but I want to end with two very important realities here. Right? Here's reality number one. The embarrassing fact that when somebody lists the top 10 countries in broadband penetration by population, we're nowhere on the list. Our broadband is not acceptable for the United States. Reality number two, that despite the objectives and the policy statements and the hopes of many over the last 10 years, we still have not achieved a clear network neutrality policy that is viewed as enforceable and meaningful from the FCC or Congress. Now, one conclusion you could draw from those two realities is that the absence of regulation does not produce abundant broadband, because we've effectively had no regulation, which the providers have been opposing, yet we don't have broad growth in broadband relative to other countries. Now, that would be a little bit unfair, because they could respond, well, we've had this uncertain question about whether we're going to get regulation, and that's why we haven't invested as much as we would invest if we just clearly knew we could do whatever the hell we wanted. But there is one certainty here. In the most important space for competition, we see which architecture has worked. And the architecture which has worked doesn't depend on promises or trust. It depends upon what the architecture enables. And what it enables is maximizing competition in the space that provides real value in this economy and the content and applications. We need to put away in this debate the radical theories that would drive us away from that reality. We need to be conservative in this debate and preserve what has worked in driving this economy. And what has worked is a neutral network. Thank you very much.